His life was very peaceful. He had no enemies or worries. It was the perfect life that anyone could dream of until suddenly that world vanished, replaced by one where the strongest rule, a world where his family was taken from him. This is the story of our protagonist named Sanji. He went from being a normal college boy to become an ultimate warrior, better known as the master player, with the sole purpose of recovering everything he had lost. So let's start with this summary. Secret player summarized in the duration of the video. We started this story with our main character Sanji walking down the street discussing what he would buy as a gift for his sister. Today his sister Sanga had a birthday, and to celebrate the main character's mother organized a dinner at the Shinran station. So the main character was heading towards there. Sanga was the younger sister of the main character. According to him, her sister was very intelligent, organized, and sometimes she felt that sisterly affection that despite having a bad temper, he loved her too much. So she could not arrive empty-handed and not give anything away. In an instant a noise is heard, and it turns out that a drain had appeared just at the Shinran station without any explanation. The protagonist with what he thinks clarifies that these drains have been happening around the world. Something strange was happening. The protagonist he rushes to get to the station, but when he sees there was no station anymore. A terribly giant drain had made the station disappear, or at least that's what the authorities thought. The protagonist knew that the family reunion was in this place. So the protagonist begins to worry, immediately calls his younger sister. But she did not answer, so he decides to return home. He could not be calm even though he was trying to convince himself of a good situation. He was already desperate to see his family safe and sound. When he finally arrived he thought that no one was home, but he heard the tone of his sister's cell phone. So he relaxed. Nothing was wrong. Everyone was at home. At least that was what he thought. They were at home, but his mom, his sister and his father had been murdered. The protagonist couldn't believe it, and suddenly an unknown number was calling him on the phone. By the way, 1004 and Angel in Korean are pretty much the same thing. The call answers itself as if the cell phone had a life of its own. The protagonist couldn't believe what the hell his family was going through. Murdered by him, and now a number that knew his name. Was he the murderer? The guy on the phone told him that everything was real, and that he would help him by guiding him. From now on we're going to call him Angel because it's easier to remember. He says that the protagonist's family wasn't dead yet, at least not completely. The protagonist takes her sister and tries to wake her up, but she doesn't wake up. Angel begins to explain the situation to him. Just before the protagonist's family was murdered, the most important places in the world were being trapped in copies of an artificial intelligence, a much higher one that had physical power over the real world. This intelligence was what it did. It was to convert real places into data to add something called coding to their world, the goal of similes. The name of artificial intelligence was to absorb the whole world as if it were data, and then convert it to take over reality, creating a different world, a world with monsters, maps, NPCs and magic items. By the way, NPCs are system characters. All this problem was due to intelligence artificial. A sink in the Shinran station was because that field tried to be converted into metadata. Even now, the place where the protagonist was being converted into data. So Angel tells the protagonist that before his family was converted into data, had been attacked by a player, a system player, and it was a very strong, high-ranked one. But I couldn't give him the details since I had very limited information, and everything, both the sump and the death of his family, had been the fault of this player. Suddenly the body of the protagonist's sister begins to fade, becoming data for the similes system. Angel tells the protagonist that if this continued his family would be erased from similes, so he had to register as a player and find them in that world. He had the right to become a player, and in order to save his family, he had to complete the missions. Doing the missions would have Sanchez to find them. Of course, also the guy guilty of all this. So the protagonist agrees to become a player of the system Similes, and is transported to the world of Similes. The protagonist is taken to the Shinran station of Similes. There he begins to wonder why there was no damage, if it is supposed that the sump had destroyed the whole place. But the place was very calm, and Angel makes his official presentation. He would be the one who would support that the protagonist is like a voice assistant, an artificial intelligence created by the Similes system. The protagonist asks Angel how he was supposed to save his family, and the AI tells him that he should become the master player, and Angel explains again that Similes was a artificial intelligence with incredible power that transformed real places into data and reconstructed them on his own map and his own version. The protagonist asks him if he was in Similes. So now he was also data? Angel answers that not in general, if they are converted into data. But there is a small group that are chosen, since when they wake up in this new world, they obtain special abilities. Those were the so-called players. So the protagonist was definitely not a piece of information. Even so, the protagonist's family were not players. They were most likely turned into data as part of the game. Although Angel affirms that at this moment, the information was cut off and only controlled Similes, that was being controlled by the master player was the one who decided what information he could obtain. Apart from the master player was the only one who could reverse the modification of the field, that is, he could return to his family to the real world. And for the protagonist to become the master player, he had to obtain some pieces of code hidden around the world that had created Similes. So what he had to do was collect the code pieces to become the great master, and power saves his family, who was converted into data, returning him to the real world. But Angel clarifies that it would not be easy at all. There were many players in this world, and many of them also went for those codes. There was even a very dangerous group that had abilities supernatural, world ranking top abilities. Angel quickly turns into a good headset that apparently connected to the protagonist's brain, and he already had access to every data in the system, or at least the data that the master player wanted him to see. Angel was very important, since as an assistant he had all kinds of information on the use of combat elements and many other things such as objects necessary to survive, so he should not lose or destroy it. Also, to survive in this world ruled by force, he had to find his ability, especially if he failed to awaken his ability, he would be considered incapable of being a player, so he would be erased from the world. The protagonist asks Angel how to find that ability. Suddenly a simile monster appears, a monster created by the system, a monster that was once a real person, now only dedicated to killing players in this new world. Even so, this was simply a tutorial. In the current state of the protagonist, it is some kind of zombie, was very dangerous. The protagonist runs and begins to wonder how he could do it if there was nothing around with what to hit him. The only thing was the fire extinguisher that the zombie carried. The protagonist is careless, and the zombie manages to bite his arm, but he takes it off. Now Sanji was only thinking about how to get out of the tutorial alive. He had been injured and had several toxins all over his body. Angel lets him know and tells him that he must eliminate the monster in order to survive, since this monster only had the instinct to delete players. Sanji remembers that if he did not fight he would die, and if he did not win he would lose his family. He completely decides to kill the zombie, and Angel automatically activates the combat mode, a mode in which he could see the statistics of the monsters, although a bar appears out of nowhere, red one, that told him the weak point. Sanji picks up the fire extinguisher from the ground and smashes the zombie's face in. He sent it flying down the stairs, thus completing the mission of defeating the monster. Angel tells him that his fight had been excellent. He performed very well. Now, because of what he achieved, he could relax from his injuries and his toxins. These injuries would be healed. He also gets a small bonus since most of the players are killed by the first monster they encounter. They panic and give up, but the protagonist had completed his first mission in an excellent way. In addition, he had sharpened the reaction speed and hearing of him and the monster. After being eliminated, his data is destroyed. A while later, the protagonist, walking wondering what his special ability was, heard a shot from the floor above. So the protagonist decides to investigate what was happening, and it turns out that there were many people, but they were having a discussion. Since there were 3 players and an unidentifiable data means that one of them had his information blocked, and not even Angel knew the cause. This was the first time that something like this had happened, but they discover that the main character was hiding, and Sanji decides that this is not the time to fight. We have to think things through and find out better what is happening. We are introduced to this person called Jo, a guy looking for fights who just had a gun and was the one who had found the protagonist. Jo was very convinced that the person who had his information blocked was a monster, and he thought he should eliminate him so that he could get his reward, but the protagonist, through a red window, could clearly see that it was an NPC, that is, a game data. The problem with all this is that if a game data is hurt, the NPC is rooted so that do not generate any error, and this could hurt everyone around. Only the protagonist could see his information, no one else could see it, because it was just blocked for artificial intelligence systems. Like Angel, the protagonist tells Jo to stop. She was an NPC, and she couldn't hurt her, or everyone would be killed, but Jo was upset if he wanted to get his reward. He was also armed, and he didn't plan to stop. Suddenly the voice of the system tells everyone that this was also a tutorial, and they should delete the monster between them, so they could continue how to complete the Shinran map, eliminating the boss, and they would have chances to win a code piece. The protagonist was left thinking that this was his opportunity to advance as a master player. However, Jo now had even more to win to eliminate the supposed monster. The protagonist asks his assistant about the red window, but Angel did not know about the red window. It was an ability that only he could see. In fact, if he managed to see the information that was blocked, that was a unique aspect from the master player. Jo was about to shoot the NPC, and the protagonist was clear that the girl was not a monster, and if she died, they would all be killed. Decides to attack Jo from behind. The protagonist confiscates his weapon, repeating that it was not a hidden monster, and if it were, it would not be hidden if someone like Jo were able to find it. The problem is that Jo already had his special ability activated, something that the main character did not have yet, and worst of all was Jo's special ability. He had an attack type 1 with which he could shoot projectiles, and could even empower them with magic. The protagonist had managed to enter automatic combat mode, however he couldn't stand it for long, as after using the skill, he consequently has a huge burden of pain on the user. The types of skills that exist are the attack type, type of healing, check type, manifestation type, and finally, the special type. Although the special type are those who stand out for having paranormal talents in daily life, such as the ability to clean the floor very quickly, or the ability to unlock passwords, and that kind of thing for daily life. But in combat, they are useless, and the protagonist asks Angel to identify what his type of ability was, and Angel replies that it would take time since his characteristics were very special. Jo manages to find where the protagonist was hiding, and before shooting him, the protagonist manages to find his special ability, which was a control type that specifically serves to create remote attacks by controlling gravity or objects close to the user. Joe uses a health position to recover his arm, and before a clash between these two, Jue appears, an old friend of the protagonist, who coincidentally was Joe's cousin. She looks much stronger than him, and claims him for fighting instead of looking for companions, as she had already told her. She feels very surprised to have found the protagonist in this situation, since her family had also become Data, and she and her cousin were the only ones who became players. She wanted to find more people to help her to find a clue code. It's a piece of map information, and it's very essential to figure out how to beat the boss of each map. Now we are at the train station where the clue code was supposed to be. We meet Zombie, a very egocentric upper-class guy. He tells the protagonist that they no longer need more people, and that they were going to leave here because there was no way to find the clue code, but Jue continues to believe that there are still ways to find out, and the people begin to think that it is better to leave the station to go look elsewhere. However, the protagonist wanted to try something different, and using his control-type ability manages to open the doors of the train. Before everyone entered to see what was on the train, Zombie runs into a very strange guy, a guy who had a dead face. Despite being looking for the track, still had not managed to advance, and artificial intelligences feel a presence of high energy in the next train car when the protagonist goes to look for was the madman before tearing apart an NPC. Out of nowhere, Zombie receives a weapon by the system. The idiot concludes that he had been given to eliminate the madman, and without thinking twice kills him. The protagonist was very angry because that crazy zombie was a person in real life, and told Zombie that he had no right to take the lives of others. Jua also told him that was not right. The NPC's body exploded and almost killed everyone on the train, or at least that's what they made it look like. Honestly, I wanted to see a lot of fire explosion, but nothing. It was just like a flash. The main character punches Zombie in the face in front of everyone, making him feel humiliated, and increases his hatred towards the main character. Now, do you remember the people that I had told you that they had given up and wanted to go look somewhere else? After they left and the protagonist managed to open the train, a barrier was created that did not allow them to return to the train, and suddenly they were ambushed by monsters that killed everyone who tried to flee. The Prota returns to where the NPC had been destroyed, looking to see if the clue to the code was in the rest of the body that was left, but there was no body. There was no corpse. That made no sense. At least Angel explains that regardless of the entity's situation there should be a corpse, since after all in essence they were human beings, but there was nothing. The Shinran map was operating to eliminate the players, and that was not how similes worked in general. Someone was manipulating the map. Someone was complicating things. The Prota tells him everything, Jo, what happened with Zombie, and the monster plus what happened with the NPC's body. There was no code clue. There was no evidence. Everything had been erased with the destruction of the NPC. Jo comes out very upset and goes straight to hit Zombie, telling him that he has been an idiot, a stupid guy, and that he is fed up with him. But the main character manages to see another window, a red window, something that only he could see, and it said that there was an incredible energy in the next wagon, and most probably it was the boss monster. Zombie begins to have delusions of superiority, and strangely his status window begins to change, although it changes in a subtle way, something that calls Jo's attention, but he is not interested in it. Even so, Zombie, with all that accumulated hatred in one blow, manages to activate a trap that puts the train in motion at full speed. The Prota immediately pulls out the gun that he had confiscated from Jo to make a shot with his control-type ability. The train stops accelerating, and suddenly from the cabin emerges the boss monster, or at least that's what everyone thought because of how huge it looked. Some of the companions were confident because in their tables the level of the monster was not very high, and they throw themselves together against him, but he finishes with them very easily. Now the monster in front of the protagonist, and he asks Jo to cover him. Even so, his shots do nothing, but the protagonist could see a red window telling him that the monster had hurt his left shoulder, and therefore the protagonist shoots him right there. In the middle of the battle, Jo ends up very hurt, but is rescued by Jue, so they retire to a separate carriage. The coward zombie also runs away along with Jue and Jo. The protagonist was realizing that this monster was not the boss. But if it was not the boss, then who could it be? It turns out that Zombie was more dangerous than the monster. Zombie blocks the door. His ability was manifestation type. Now the protagonist was trapped next to the monster, so he had to get rid of it quickly, so he could face Zombie before it could hurt Jue and Jo. The monster was not easy to defeat with his control type ability. He could not do anything. And again, the red window shows him another weakness of the monster, so taking advantage of that, the protagonist uses his ability and destroys the monster. Zombie, on the other hand, had already officially introduced himself as the boss, a player-type monster. The prota, after breaking some ice that Zombie had put on the map, meets Jo a little hurt, and he tells him that Zombie had taken Jue, so the prota had to hurry. On the other hand, Zombie was trying to convince Jue to leave the others, that he would take her to the end of the map, and they would leave together. But Jue didn't want to go and leave the other two behind. However, Zombie didn't agree and tried to attack her. By the way, Jue's ability was attack type and killer type, so physically she was much stronger than Zombie. But Zombie's abilities had been improved. She was much stronger and had better reflexes, so Jue couldn't do anything to her with a scalpel. But Zombie didn't expect anything and left her badly hurt. However, thanks to the fight, the ice that Zombie had created had weakened, and the prota had managed to break it much faster, so he had already arrived. Jue falls to the ground, fainting from the pain, and is trampled by Zombie. So the prota decides he will definitely finish him off. In a second, Zombie tells the protagonist that in the real world they would never have crossed words. He was just a poor bastard, and that in this world he wouldn't tolerate crossing words with a poor bastard. But the protagonist puts an end to Zombie's life. He had managed to defeat the boss of the Shinran station, had already completed the entire map. The protagonist, thanks to see completed the map of the Shinran station, receives a boost in strength, agility, and dexterity. He also receives the opportunity to choose a prize. The main character doesn't think twice. He already knew where what he wanted was. The protagonist, without so much ado, manages to obtain his first code fragment. This would help him become the master player. Angel asks him how he did it. The protagonist tells him that with the red windows, he could see all the objects. Angel tells him that this was impossible. It could easily be a system error, so he couldn't tell anyone. That kind of abilities only the master player has. Besides, the power he used against the previous enemies, like Jo, was indeed control type. But against the monster of the station, it had been of manifestation type. It was obvious what he used against Zombie before eliminating him had clearly been of attack type combined with manifestation. His special ability was too special, so he had to be careful until he understood perfectly what it was about, and not to tell anyone about it. It seems that Angel is more than a helper. He is a good advisor. Then Jue tells the protagonist that he had won a special sword. It was a steel sword of grade A, but the prota didn't use that kind of weapon. Finally, they are transported out of the map. The news starts to spread all over the world. Some guys had successfully completed the Shinran map. The prota and Jue appeared in another city. It's a city the boys already knew. Suddenly a policeman arrives and interrogates them. It was a so-called survivor inspector, so they were supposed to give him some data, but the prota is suspicious and questions him. The policeman tells him that if they don't intend to obey, it would be better to eliminate them. Jue, trying to protect the prota, tries to attack the inspector. The policeman almost eliminated her if she had not been saved. Shin and her partner Hanso, we are introduced to a new character. She was the co-president of the company Klein. a company that was practically dedicated to rescuing surviving gamers, since the instructors had actually killed more than 1,000 players in the last month. The guys end up going to a more secluded place to talk a bit. The inspectors or supervisors were a group of forces on the fringes of the law, forces that enforce the world's own laws. However, lately the system itself had warned only the high-ranking players that a new high-ranking player would appear, about a new player with a high probability of becoming the master. So since then, the supervisors have been killing all the new survivors that have arrived from the maps. That's why Shin wants to find that person who has a high chance to become the master. But the protagonist wasn't interested in any of that. All he wanted was to get his family back and return to the real world. Yet Shin tells the protagonist that the Shinran map had been hacked. It was a member of the supervisors. One of the strongest had hacked the Shinran map. That guy was ranked 3rd in the world and his name was Yug. Surprisingly, that was the same name of a former friend of the main character, and of Jue. But he was a good guy. He couldn't be the same, at least they thought so. Shin tells them that among all the supervisors, he was one of the most fearsome, and the most bloodthirsty. He also had a special ability capable of surpassing all of his stats, even above the system's established limit. They were a complete monster. After hearing this, the protagonist asks Shin for help. He'll tell him everything he wants to know, and Shin of course accepts it. He wanted to help him anyway, but before he started working at the city hall, at the town hall, they had to do a mandatory procedure after they finished the tutorial. By the way, the tutorial was the Shinran map, but Sanji got a hack tutorial. Fortunately, very few people were going that early to the town hall, so they head there. As soon as the main character arrives, he starts to do the paperwork. Just the person who was taking care of the main character was a friend of his sister. Sanji was an NPC in this world, so she had very limited access to space. She couldn't go where she wanted to go, and she couldn't go against the system either. But she was on the protagonist's side, so she wouldn't tell on him, because Sanji wanted to keep hidden the fact that he was the one who had completed the map of Shinran. She wishes the best for the protagonist and tells him that she would be on his side and help him in every way possible. There were still no rewards for completing the Shinran map, so the protagonist only gets Zumbi's identification. The protagonist rejects it, but she convinces him to keep it. Also, Sanji tells the protagonist that his stats were too low for someone who defeated the boss, so the main character should have done a scan, since each creature in Similes has its own code. By scanning the stats of other players, you could absorb those abilities. In addition, you could also scan the code of a dead player to steal the stats. However, this type of players receive penalties on their stat. They are banned from certain places in the Simile world. Scanning is considered illegal, so when they steal stats, they do it from a very strong monster. Also, the protagonist is given a bank statement of money where he is left with practically nothing. Finishing the paperwork, and the protagonist crosses paths with an old friend whose name was Yug. The author gives us a flashback of how the protagonist had met this boy. Ji was very lonely. The protagonist befriended him and included him among the other boys. When he grew up, Ji traveled abroad, and they never met again until now. The protagonist told Ji that his sister had missed him. His parents had also missed him a lot, including him. However, despite all the love he had for her, he was going to pay for what he had done to her. He was going to pay for what he had done to his family. Ji doesn't even pretend, and he himself admits that he murdered the protagonist's family. So they both activate the combat mode. However, the combat mode in public facilities, such as the city hall, was forbidden. However, it doesn't matter. The protagonist finally had face-to-face with the murderer of his family. Automatically, a shield was created to separate the protagonist from the other people. In the town hall, Jinte told him that he was surprised by how strong the main character was. He had tried it twice before. The first time was when he went to his apartment, but he wasn't there. So before murdering his family, he had planned to wait for the main character. But he received an urgent call. Then it was about the map of the station. using zombie, which in the end didn't work at all. But the protagonist gets tired of hearing him talk. Apparently GD had a protective barrier that no one could break. However, it was momentarily deactivated by the prota's attack, which didn't make sense. So GD activates his special ability, adjusting all his stats, overcoming all limits with the intention of killing the protagonist once and for all. The fight was difficult, even the scans didn't work in this area, but the protagonist was badly wounded. But the protagonist was still alive while he thought of how to eliminate him. GD keeps talking as the protagonist's family was heard screaming and dying before his eyes. But the protagonist, using his manifestation type ability, had managed to trick GD with a clone. However, GD was very strong, and there was no way to surprise him. GD realizes the piece of code that the prota had. Exactly why the protagonist was putting up such a fight. Shin and his partner try to help the protagonist by pulling him out of the fight and protecting him with a shield. Even so, they were not enough to protect the protagonist from GD's blow. Now the protagonist is wounded and goes into masochistic mode. He tells GD that no matter what, he himself was going to end his life. Then the protagonist begins to form a kind of bomb. GD couldn't do anything and only tried to move away, but the protagonist didn't want to let him go. Apparently the protagonist was willing to die in order to kill GD. GD lost his arm after only an instant of being exposed to this power. It withered away. Even so, the city council wanted to penalize them and stop them by force. So GD managed to save himself. Even so, the protagonist was badly wounded and GD was ready to leave, sure that the protagonist was dead. Jua tries to attack him, but he simply ignores her and leaves. Hanso tries to heal the protagonist, since he is a high-ranking healer guy. Unfortunately, being cut by the black-bladed sword was very difficult. On the other hand, GD, remembering what had just happened, he says that the power the protagonist used can only be related to the master's code. It didn't make sense that he had that power, but he had already been stabbed by the black blade, so the protagonist would die if he would die. Back to the protagonist, though he looked really bad. His wound had already been healed a while ago. A healing type regeneration of the highest level had been used inside the protagonist's body. Hanso didn't know how he had managed to heal himself. Even so, the protagonist himself was healed and thinking about it. Shin remembers how the protagonist's shot easily pierced through GD's shield. For a beginner to have a piece of code meant that he himself had been the one to clean the Shinran map. Then she understood that she had finally found the person who could change similes. Okay guys, let's stop here for today. If you want a second part, subscribe to bring the second part. Thanks for watching and bye.